Hi, I want to welcome you to today's OBSSR Directors webinar titled Webs of Wellness, Connections Between Mind, Body, and Community for Making Change. I'm Christine Hunter, the Acting Director of the Office of Behavioral and Social Sciences Research, or OBSSR, at the National Institutes of Health. Before I introduce today's speaker, I want to mention a few housekeeping items. So first, today's webinar is being recorded, and the recording will be available in about 1 month on the OBSSR website at obssr.od.nih.gov. Today's presentation will be followed by a question and answer session. Throughout the talk, all attendees are muted and the chat feature is disabled. However, questions and comments can be taken via the Zoom Q&A feature. So to ask a question or send a comment, click on Q&A at the bottom of your Zoom screen, type in your question or comment, and then hit send. You also have the option to like other questions to avoid duplicate posts. The most liked questions will move to the top. Feel free to send a question at any time during the webinar. Following the presentation, OBSSR's Dr. Kristen Brethel-Horowitz will facilitate the Q&A session and ask your questions to the presenter. And so with that, I'm very pleased to introduce today's presenter, Dr. Emily Falk. Dr. Falk studies behavior change, persuasion, and how ideas and behaviors spread. She's a professor of communication, psychology, and marketing at the University of Pennsylvania. She's also the Associate Dean for Research at the Annenberg School for Communication, the Director of Penn's Communication Neuroscience Lab, and a Distinguished Fellow of the Annenberg Public Policy Center. Dr. Falk is an expert in the science of behavior change. Her research uses tools from psychology, neuroscience, and communication to examine what makes messages persuasive, why and how ideas spread, and what makes people effective communicators. Her research has been recognized by numerous awards, including early career awards from the International Communication Association, the Society for Personality and Social Psychology Attitudes Division, a Fulbright grant, the Social and Affective Neuroscience Society, a DARPA Young Faculty Award, and the NIH Director's New Innovator Award. She was also named a Rising Star by the Association for Psychological Science. So it's some pretty impressive credentials. She received her bachelor's degree in neuroscience from Brown University and her PhD in psychology from the University of California, Los Angeles. It's my great pleasure to welcome Dr. Emily Falk to present today on Webs of Wellness, Connections Between Mind, Body, and Community for Making Change. And with that, I turn it over to Dr. Falk. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Christine. I am so pleased to be here with you. And thanks to Kristen and Erica for helping organize this and having me. So what I want to talk about today is a big set of topics because we're facing global challenges right now. And these include intertwined mental health crises, the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic, spikes in our collective blood pressure, more time for many of us spent sitting, more frequent and severe climate disasters, and the anxiety that comes with all of this. And so a big question that's been on my mind a lot these days is how do we maintain a sense of wellness in the face of all of these challenges? And this is obviously a huge question that goes way beyond the hour that we'll have together today, but I'm going to approach this problem in a few different ways. So in the first part of this webinar, I want to talk about some data on well-being in young people that highlights the benefits of having a sense of purpose or connecting with our core values in life and how individual health behaviors relate to that sense of purpose. Then next, I'm going to show you some data about how tapping into things that bring us that sense of meaning and purpose, like our core values, can make us more open to changing health behaviors, and also what that looks like in our brains when it's happening. And then finally, I want to talk a little bit about how we scale these changes up by encouraging people to share high quality health information with other people. So starting with the first part of this puzzle, I'm going to show you some initial findings from a large interdisciplinary collaboration that's focused on well-being in college students. And in particular, the sample that I'm going to show you comes from Penn, where I'm faculty, and Columbia universities. And we're interested in young people like college students because college and this transition into young adulthood is a time of independence for many of us, but also a time of vulnerability. And so across our team, we've uncovered a lot of different insights from many studies with groups of young people. But I'm going to first focus on work today that's from a large interdisciplinary collaboration that includes over 70 scientists in my lab and also other labs at Penn, Columbia, Dartmouth, and Brigham Young University. And this work is focused on some of Yuna Kang's research, and she's a superstar research director who's in my lab. She's also looking at tenure track jobs for folks who might be hiring. As well as in the middle part of my talk, work by Amanda McGowan in David Leiden-Staley's lab and Ovidius Denoy in Kevin Oxner's lab. So Yuna's research program really highlights purpose in life as an important psychological resource that we can call upon in the face of the kinds of challenges that I opened the talk with. So purpose in life refers to having a sense that one's life is meaningful and has clear goals and directions. And purpose has been linked to all kinds of different health benefits. So for example, having a strong sense of purpose in our life, or this kind of set of goals that comes from our core values, has been associated with reduced risk of chronic conditions like cognitive impairment, stroke, cardiovascular events, better glucoregulation, and even just an overall reduced risk of mortality. And having a strong sense of purpose or direction can make it easier for us to make our little day-to-day decisions as well that are consistent with kind of a bigger picture path or set of goals that we have. So for example, in Yuna's research, she's shown that people who have a stronger sense of purpose show less conflict-related activity in their brains when they're exposed to coaching messages that suggest that they should adopt specific kinds of health behaviors like physical activity. In addition, consistent with this idea that having a bigger picture sense of purpose can help us make better decisions in a day-to-day setting, stronger purpose has been associated with a greater likelihood of using preventative health services, increased medication adherence, more physical activity, and pretty much correlationally, there's a lot of evidence that having a strong sense of purpose is related to better health. And so given this kind of background, I would like everybody to just take a minute and think about what comes to mind for you when you think about people who have a strong sense of purpose. So maybe for some of you, you might think about folks like Mother Teresa or Martin Luther King, or reading the news, maybe Vladimir Zelensky. And these people do show a strong sense of purpose. But I want to highlight today that purpose isn't just something that you have or you don't have. It's something that can fluctuate for each of us on a moment-to-moment and day-to-day basis. So if you think about this for yourself, you might think about a time when you felt particularly clear on a goal or where you wanted to take your life. And I'm guessing that for many of us, some days feel more purposeful than others. And psychologists have developed interventions to help people feel more purposeful and align their day-to-day behaviors more with their goals and values. And I'll talk about that in the second part of the talk. And these kinds of psychological interventions can be powerful. But in the first part of the talk, what I want to think about is, what if there are other small things that we can do on a day-to-day basis that are also related to that sense of having meaning or having purpose in our lives? So in thinking about this question, Amanda McGowan and David Leiden-Staley encouraged us to think about wellness as a networked system. And so building on prior research on wellness more broadly, we measured a wide range of dimensions of wellness and wellness behaviors. So in addition to people's sense of purpose in life, we also measured things like their sleep quality, their physical activity, how much alcohol they were drinking, social behaviors, like how they were connecting with friends, how frequently, what the quality of those interactions was, and psychological variables like their mood and anxiety. And we tested whether these basic health behaviors work together to form an interconnected web that might support people's sense that they have purpose in their lives. So to do this, we collected data from June until October of 2020 in college students at Penn and Columbia as part of this bigger interdisciplinary effort that I mentioned earlier. And I'm happy to talk about the bigger data set in the Q&A. And that big data set includes students who are part of 24 different student groups at Penn and Columbia. So these are things like arts organizations, Greek organizations, performance groups, sororities, fraternities, like a bunch of different chosen social groups. And this bigger data set has information about the students' social networks within those groups. So for example, who is close to whom, who drinks together, and so on. So that each student nominated different group members who they felt close to, who they saw as leaders, and a bunch of other questions that allowed us to map their social networks. And I'll come back to that briefly in a little while. We also captured a range of well-being measures and brain scans from before the pandemic. And what I'm going to focus on today, which is experience sampling data that measured information about people's health behaviors. So for folks who aren't familiar with the term experience sampling, it means that we sent our participants messages twice each day and asked them to tell us about what was happening in their real life, like as they were going about it with their phones. And so these questions asked them to tell us about their recent social interactions, their mood, how well they slept the night before, how much physical activity they had gotten, how much they felt a sense of direction and purpose in their life, as well as how much alcohol they drank. And this design allowed us to investigate within participants how fluctuations in these different dimensions of wellness related to one another from moment to moment and then from day to day. And with these data, we were also able to explore which elements of daily wellness are connected to one another in that web of wellness, as well as how purpose fits into this picture. So just to give you a little bit of background, past research has often considered bivariate relationships between these wellness variables. So for example, there's a ton of evidence from, for example, prior cross-sectional studies that shows that how much we move throughout the day relates to how well we sleep at night. Past research has also shown that physical activity, taking a brisk walk, can put you in a good mood. Likewise, getting a lousy night's sleep can put you in a bad mood the next day. And we also know that a lot of these relationships are bidirectional. So sleeping well can influence how much you move, and how much you move can influence your sleep. And we can also look at laboratory studies that have shown, for example, that a short burst of exercise enhances positive mood and alleviates negative mood, or that following an evening of sleep deprivation in the lab, people exercise for a shorter duration and experience higher amounts of negative mood. Even in animal models, wheel running prevents sleep-deprived, anxiety-like behaviors in rats. And so while these lab-based studies tell us what can happen, they may or may not map onto what actually happens in our day-to-day life. So that's where the experience sampling comes in. Likewise, we know that physical activity is related to mood, but what about something bigger, like our sense of purpose? So mood is sort of more of an immediate thing maybe, but how might all of these pieces of the puzzle fit together, and do they relate to our bigger picture goals and values and our sense of alignment with them? So for example, if a poor night's sleep puts you in a bad mood, does it also make it difficult to accomplish our goals and feel that bigger picture sense of purpose? Or if getting active puts you in a good mood, would that also provide a sense of accomplishment maybe and help people feel more purposeful? So using the experience sampling data that I mentioned, we first considered how people's day-to-day behaviors related to their sense of purpose. And so this is work that Amanda McGowan led. And here we found that within a given day, when people got more physical activity at one time point, they were happier at the next time point a few hours later, and they also felt less anxious. They also, in addition to that immediate mood, felt more purposeful. Next, we looked at what happened from one day to the next. So instead of hours to hours, what happened from today to tomorrow. And here we saw that getting better quality sleep the night before and being in a more positive, less anxious mood was associated with feeling more purposeful the next day. So across our moment-to-moment and day-to-day experiences, these kinds of building blocks of wellness seem to work together in a web. But these variables that I've shown you so far leave out one of the most important ingredients in our well-being as humans, which is our connections to other people. So in addition to the behaviors that we do as individuals, there's also a huge amount of literature that shows that our social networks matter for our well-being. This could be in part because other people who are around us influence what we do. We'll touch on that a little bit more later in the talk. And people who surround us can also provide social support. So, like I said, in the later part of today's talk, I'll tell you more about what motivates people to share and to try to influence each other. But first, I'm going to focus on the social connection part of it. So, with the social interaction variables that we collected in our day-to-day experience sampling, you might recall that we asked people to tell us twice each day about their recent social interactions. So this is work that's led by Ovidia Stenoy and Kevin Oxner. And we found that following days in which participants felt closer to their interaction partners, they experienced higher purpose in life. In other words, on a day-to-day basis, connecting with friends was related to feeling that stronger sense of direction and purpose. And our data also allowed us to look at the broader social resources that people had access to in the groups that they were part of as part of that social network survey that I mentioned earlier. So making use of the baseline social network data that we collected where people nominated different people they felt close to in their social groups, we also found the participants who felt more close to more peers in their group on average also felt less negative emotion and stress throughout the month when we were collecting these experience sampling data at the start of the pandemic. So this is a moment when everybody had moved home. It was a super stressful period for these college students, and everyone in the world. So another way to think about this is that when our college students had more close connections to friends in their groups, they felt less bad on a day-to-day basis. And so we might ask the question, how do we end up feeling close to other people? And one way that we do this is by sharing our experiences with them. So in the experience sampling data, when people shared emotions during their social interactions, it predicted stronger feelings of closeness toward the other person. And this was true, interestingly, regardless of whether or not the participant or their interaction partner was the person who made the disclosure. So sharing a personal experience or emotional experience emerged as one way of creating closeness. And this also then had the downstream effects on well-being and purpose that I mentioned earlier. So we've seen so far in the first part of this talk that purpose fluctuates on a day-to-day basis, and that our other health behaviors like sleep and physical activity and maintaining social connections can help boost that sense of purpose. In turn, we might ask, what are the benefits then of having this clearer sense of purpose for our health? So as we discussed before, there's this huge body of research that correlationally shows that having a stronger sense of purpose is associated with all kinds of benefits, and there's causal experiments that show some of the reasons why that might be true. But there's still a lot of open questions about why. And so to get at this question, one of the senior research directors who I introduced you to earlier, Yuna Kang, hypothesized that people who had a stronger sense of purpose might be more able to make healthier decisions. For example, resist behaviors that can be health harming, like drinking. So to study this, she also looked at our experience sampling data about people's day-to-day purpose. So remember, we're messaging them each day to have them tell us about how purposeful they're feeling. And she linked it to their day-to-day drinking. So how much alcohol they drank and at what frequency. And what she found was that in general, we see that alcohol craving is positively related to how much people drink. So when people drink, when people crave, they also drink. But she found that feeling a stronger sense of purpose in the moment was protective for people, particularly people who had higher brain cue activity to alcohol cues and might be at a higher potential risk for drinking when they're in a situation encountering alcohol. So among these folks whose brains were more reactive to alcohol cues, feeling purposeful in their day-to-day life prospectively decoupled the link between craving and the amount that they drank. So another way to think about this is that having a strong sense of purpose on a given day might be especially beneficial during health decision-making where people need to regulate their reactivity towards some kind of rewarding but not long-term healthy behavior. In addition, Yuna's research also suggests that purpose can be protective in other health behavior change contexts. So, for example, also over time, the day-to-day feelings of being purposeful might also build other psychological resources that lead to healthy behaviors. So in another project that Yuna led at the start of the pandemic, people who felt more purposeful were less lonely when things shut down at the start of COVID, and they were more willing to engage in COVID protective behaviors like social distancing. So taken together, these data highlight, I think, the interconnectedness of our daily behaviors, not only for our immediate mood, our feelings of happiness and anxiety, but also for these bigger picture psychological resources like our sense of purpose. Purpose is really important for our health. And these data also then suggest that helping people, for example, get more active, get better sleep, could be good targets for intervention to increase people's sense of purpose in the face of these big stressors like a pandemic. Also, I think this kind of networked way of thinking about wellness is also helpful because realistically, we can't do every single thing in a given day. So for example, for some people, it might be more important today to connect with a loved one. For someone else, it might be more important to prioritize sleep. And we're working on using these networked models to build personalized predictions of what might help boost people's sense of purpose and other types of well-being on a day-to-day basis. So far today, all the data that I've shown you are correlational data. And so next, building on the idea that these different elements of wellness can mutually benefit one another, I'm going to next tell you about some work that we've done showing how experimentally getting people to focus on the building blocks of purpose, like our core values, can causally change their health behaviors and also what that looks like in our brains. So before I dive into the causal data, I thought it might be helpful to share a brief personal story. I was telling the team before this webinar, I didn't actually clear this photo that's about to come with my grandmother. So if she's watching, I hope it's okay. Yuna's findings about how the sense of purpose at the beginning of COVID made people more willing to follow social distancing guidelines was helpful for me in my relationship with my grandmother at the beginning of the pandemic. So this is my grandmother, Beverly. And at the start of the pandemic, it was really clear that COVID was deadly for our elders. And at 97, my grandmother's identity as a really strong and independent woman was awesome then, but it also meant that she didn't want to stop going to the grocery store herself. She didn't want to stop taking public transit. And I knew that citing facts alone was not going to be persuasive in my pleas for her to change those kinds of risky activities. And so thinking about Yuna's work, thinking about the work in our lab, I realized that tapping into core values and purpose might be a more effective route. So I know what matters a lot to her, things like being there for her family, for me. And so I told her, I need help with our kids. I need you to help stay alive and keep them safe. And with that frame in mind, I asked her to consider changing her daily routines and avoid places with a lot of people. And she agreed, and along with my mom, helped us make it through the first year of the pandemic with our then 4 or 5-year-olds when schools were closed and online. And so purpose involves having a sense of your core values and making decisions that are aligned with them. And so next, in this second part of the talk, I want to explore whether reminding ourselves of these kinds of core values can help make us more receptive to positive changes. And a large body of research on what scientists call values affirmation highlights just this. It highlights the power of getting people to reflect on their core values. And one way that focusing on these kinds of core values might make us more receptive to adopting healthier behaviors is by providing a kind of guiding star. If we know where we want to go, we might be more motivated to do things that make us healthier, more able to achieve these kinds of goals. So when my grandmother focused on what she cared about the most, like her family, she was more open to changing her daily routines in COVID to keep herself safe. But another reason why scientists think that reflecting on core values can make us more open to change is that people want to feel good about themselves, and messages that suggest that our past behaviors aren't optimal can threaten our self-image. So for example, at the start of the pandemic, if you had conversations with loved ones about whether they had gone out or what kinds of exposures they had, we might have felt a temptation to downplay some of those kinds of activities. So I might find myself feeling defensive or coming up with reasons why particular advice doesn't really apply to me. I was only at the store for a short time. My hairdresser is really careful. But a few decades of research have found now that it's possible to reduce this kind of counter-arguing through values affirmation. And so in particular, if you have somebody first think about something that brings a lot of meaning in their lives, like for many of us, friends and family, for other folks, it might be religion or various kinds of community engagement, then we can zoom out and see that our self-worth isn't tied to a particular behavior, like whether we're smoking or how much exercise we're getting, or whether we did a perfect job with social distancing yesterday. And that can make the specific messages encouraging positive behavior change less threatening. So for many people, like I said, these values come down to relationships that we have. And my lab and others have found that this kind of values affirmation, or sometimes psychologists call it self-affirmation, can change the way that our brains process incoming information and make us more open to change. So in more work led by Yuna Kang, we've showed that values affirmation can impact how much time people spent sitting or not being active, which has a whole host of health implications, ranging from when we sit all day, we feel worse, to increased heart disease risk, increased cancer risk, increased overall mortality. And so in this work, we recruited people whose level of couch potato-dom, or for many of us, desk potato-dom, put them at high risk for disease, and therefore where messages about the risks of sitting might otherwise be threatening. And one group was randomized to get to do a values affirmation. So to think about these kinds of core values that bring a sense of meaning and purpose. And the other group was not affirmed. So they just focused on their lowest ranked value. And then we showed everybody the same kinds of health messages. So things like the more you sit, the more damage it does to your body. And according to the American Heart Association, people at your level of physical inactivity are at a much higher risk for developing heart disease. So the values affirmation was really simple. Just to give you a sense of it for folks who aren't familiar, we'd show people a list of different possible values. And let's say you chose friends and family. Then while we were scanning your brain, we'd ask you to think about a situation in the future when you might have fun with friends and family, or where you might get support from friends and family, or make time for somebody that you care about, or show your love to them. And we can compare what happens when people have first had the chance to reflect on something meaningful to them versus folks who got these kinds of prompts, but for values that they said didn't matter to them as much. And then everyone saw the same health messages. So this is key here, because everybody, while we're looking at their brain activity in response to the health coaching, is seeing literally the exact same stimuli. And they saw dozens of messages like this in the brain scanner. And we were interested in brain responses to these types of messages within parts of the brain that track how self-relevant we find things, like, what do I think of this idea? Does it relate to me? And so if values affirmation makes people feel less defensive and more receptive to health information, then they might show greater activation in these brain regions while they were viewing those coaching messages, encouraging them to get more active. In addition, we also looked at brain regions that track how rewarding and valuable we find different things. So for example, these brain regions might show increased activation if you took a sip of wine that's one of your favorite wines, or you ate a delicious chocolate, or if a friend gives you a compliment that feels really good. And so if values affirmation makes people feel more able to find personal value in the coaching messages, we might expect to see increased brain activation in these regions. And just to pause for a second here, I think it's particularly helpful to look at brain activity in working to understand things like values affirmation, because people aren't always consciously aware of how they're processing information. So when defensiveness gets in the way of being receptive to new information, we often shut it down before we can even realize that it's happening. And so being able to see what's happening in people's brains in close to real time as they're exposed to health messaging or other kinds of inputs can be really helpful. And so what we saw while people were exposed to those coaching messages within these brain regions that track self-relevance and value was that first, when they were affirmed, they showed more activity in brain regions that track self-relevance and value. And this is even though the health warnings that people received were exactly the same for the affirmation and the unaffirmed group, their brain activity differed. So after self-affirmation, people showed more activity in these regions. And this effect also replicated in a larger study that UNA led that was supported by the National Cancer Institute. So we had a pre-registered larger scale replication of these findings on brain activity. And then in addition, after the brain scanning session, we texted people for a month with messages that reminded them of their core value kind of prompts for people in the affirmation condition and the values that were less important to people for those in the control condition. So this top row is kind of representing what happened for people in the affirmation condition, and people in the control condition saw different ones. And for everybody, we tracked their physical activity using accelerometers. And what we found was that after, over that month, people in the affirmation condition decreased the amount of time they spent sitting and being sedentary. And they did this significantly more than folks in the control group. So in other words, people who were affirmed showed more declines in their sedentary behavior in the month following the intervention compared to the control condition. And this is also controlling for baseline sedentary behavior and a range of demographic factors. In addition, the more people's brains were receptive to the health messages while they were being scanned, that activation that I showed you a few minutes ago in brain regions that track self-relevance and value, the more they changed their behavior as well. And these results also replicated in the larger study that UNA ran, supported by the National Cancer Institute. So in sum, across these studies, we found that focusing on core values could increase brain activity in self-relevance and value regions, and then that this was related to how much people changed their behavior. And these results seem to be robust across studies that we ran in Michigan and Philadelphia and with different demographic groups. So helping people focus on parts of their core values, it seems like can make them more open to personal change. The last question that I want to focus on then is, how do we scale up this positive kind of change? So a few decades of research now have highlighted how strongly people's perceptions of what others are doing or what others approve of can influence our own behavior. And within the brain, my team and other teams have also found evidence for why this might be true. So for example, in the same data set that I just showed you, we looked at the social networks of people that surrounded each of our participants. So in the bigger NCI supported study that UNA ran, in addition to scanning people's brains, we asked them to tell us about the people in their social network and to rate how active those folks were as well. So what I'm showing you here is one person's close personal contacts, and the red dots are people who are relatively more active than the participant, and the blue dots are people who are relatively less active. So this person has a fairly active network. Here's an example of somebody where it's about half and half. They have some folks in their networks who are particularly active, some who are more sedentary. This person has relatively more sedentary people in their social networks. And what we found is that people who are surrounded by more physically active peers, like the social network that I'm showing you at the top of the slide, also showed more brain activation within key parts of the self-relevance and value system when they were being exposed to the health messages, which I also just showed you related to their behavior change. So this might be one path that primes people to be receptive to health messaging. In addition, we've also gotten interested in how more active sharing about norms related to health and health adjacent topics like climate action might influence people beyond those who initially heard a message. Like, how do we create a wave of positive behavioral norms? So in the last part of my talk today, I'm going to focus on what makes people not only become persuaded themselves, but also want to share information with others. And I think this is like a really important thing to understand as a tool for public health, because we see traces everywhere of how much sharing people do and how much it matters. So we know that there's an enormous amount of activity in terms of message sharing on Facebook, Twitter, email, and sharing critically affects the reach and impact of news, ideas, advertising, and our knowledge every day. So we might ask, what makes people choose to share particular ideas about health and wellness, or not share at all? And what determines the quality of that sharing? And our argument is that just like the value system can produce a domain general value signal that provides insight into how much people might value a health campaign message and change their own behavior, that it would also provide insight into the value that they perceive in sharing that information with other people. So in one early test of this idea, we studied brain responses as a group of 14 to 17-year-olds were exposed to messages from the Food and Drug Administration's Real Cost campaign, which is a national anti-smoking campaign that's aimed at high sensation-seeking teenagers. So when people were in the fMRI scanner, they were first shown a 4-second kind of countdown. Then they viewed 30-second real cost ads that were presented in random order. And after viewing each ad, the participants were prompted to indicate how willing they would be to share it on social media, to reimagine the ad in their mind's eye. And then they did a sharing task where they were, where they were where they were going to talk about the ads.
You need a little more, honey.
What's a pack of smokes cost? Your smooth skin.
See you again.
Smoking causes wrinkles that age you prematurely. What are cigarettes costing you?
Okay, so that's an example of just one of the real cost ads that they saw to give you kind of a feel for what these ads are like. And in the sharing task that they did after they were exposed to the messages, they were instructed to talk about the ad as if they were telling a friend about it. So they could say anything that they wanted to say for up to 30 seconds. And our hypothesis was that activity in the value system, as people first viewed those messages, would predict their behavior when they went to talk about the ads, so what they actually shared. And to understand this, Ray Pay and Matt O'Donnell took the transcripts of everything that the teens said while they were talking about the ads in the scanner. And they used computerized text analysis to develop this measure that we call sharing elaboration. And this captures how much the teens shared content with friends that was relevant to the message they saw and how much detail they went into. So an example here of high sharing elaboration, a teenager said, oh, this one's my favorite. This is the one where she goes in and buys the cigarettes and she doesn't have enough money, but though she does have enough money, like mentally or physically, she doesn't have enough money. And she has to peel off some of her skin to give to the lady to get the cigarettes. And then she goes on the body and then she says, I'll see you again, because cigarettes are addictive and they always come back. Like smokers always come back to get more. So, excuse me, this is an example of a really high elaboration message where the person is right on track with a lot of detail that's really relevant to what the message is about. We also had examples where folks talked about the messages, but in a less detailed and elaborate way. And so what we found was that activity in the value system, as people were watching the ads originally, which I'm showing you on the x-axis here in this figure, did indeed predict sharing elaboration in the teens. So what we see is that the more their brains were responsive to the messages in the value system, the more of this sharing elaboration they did. And interestingly, when we put both brain activity and intentions to share in the same model, the brain activity still predicted the quality of their sharing behavior, which highlights that it's giving us some useful information that's a little bit different than what we got from their self-reports. So finally, we can ask whether this pattern scales up to predict larger scale sharing and what the sources of that value might be as people are considering what to share with one another. Excuse me. So the core of this question is, what makes some ideas get shared at large scale when others don't? And what are the processes that take hold in our brains that might lead to sharing? So for example, we might share because we think it'll make us look good, because we think that what we're sharing might benefit other people, that other people might like it. And starting with our earliest work on sharing, like the work that Matt and Ray did, we found neural evidence for 3 kind of core components of successful sharing that include activity in the value system, like I just described, and then also activity in brain regions that track self-relevance, like what do I think of this, as well as social relevance. So thinking about what other people think and feel, which might help us understand what another person values or whether they would appreciate the message. And so successful propagation relies on being able to understand and forecast what other people will like or what they'll think about ideas. And this kind of social thought most typically recruits some of the brain regions that I'm showing you here. And so I think this is worth appreciating as an amazing feature of human brains. Like, although it might not seem obvious at first, understanding what other people think and feel is not only key to our survival, but also something that's really important for our day-to-day well-being, like we talked about at the beginning of the talk. And the more we see activation in these kinds of brain regions, the more willing people are to share information with others. And so together we call this value-based virality. So in other words, when people are exposed to ideas of various types, the amount of activation we see in brain regions that we've chosen for their role in self-relevance and social relevance also then relates to how much activity we see in the brain's value system and how much those articles get shared. So to just give you a little bit of a flavor for how we've studied this, as one example, we looked at articles in the New York Times health section. And here are just a couple of examples of the kinds of headlines and teasers that we looked at. We had 80 different articles like this. And for each of the 80 articles, we scanned the brains of 40 people in Philadelphia. And what you need to know is that as we scanned their brains, we had them rate after seeing the headline and teaser, whether they would share the article or not. And we found first that activation in all 3 of these hypothesized brain systems that track value, self-relevance, and social relevance related to people's interest in sharing the information. So the more the participants wanted to share the articles, the more we saw increased activation in these brain regions. But then scaling this up to the population level, we wondered whether brain activity in our small group of people could also tell us something about a larger scale phenomenon like virality. And so in this study, we took data from the New York Times API. So like if you click share on their website, they record that information. And we recorded about 100,000 shares across the 80 articles in about half a year. And we found that the more brain activity we saw in that small group of people within their value systems, the more those articles got shared by the population of New York Times readers around the world. And importantly, just like the work I showed you earlier, having brain data gave us some information that was different than what we got just from people's self-reports of what they would want to share. And we also found support for these antecedents like self-relevance and social relevance feeding into the value calculation and then being related to larger scale sharing. But as I started this talk with, the things that affect our health and well-being aren't just limited to immediate health behaviors like sitting or smoking or the things that were part of our original study. They also include having a safe and livable environment. So in a large collaboration with Christine Schultz's lab at the University of Amsterdam, I should have said Christine was the lead author on this original work on value-based virality. She's now a professor in the Netherlands. And so in collaboration with her lab and Heng-Yi Chan, who was our shared postdoc, we decided to see if we could replicate these findings in the US and the Netherlands, and to further explore whether brain activity could predict population level virality in the 2 different cultural samples, and also expanding from not only health articles to also climate action articles as well. And so a few quick details about this study. We expanded to 96 different New York Times articles that focused on health and climate. And for each of the New York Times articles, we obtained the number of shares that they had through Facebook using a service called CrowdTangle. And then unlike in our previous study where we only had participants in the US, here we had participants in Philadelphia and in Amsterdam. When we pooled those participants together, both their self-reports and their brain signals predicted article virality. So this was a replication of Christine's earlier work. Then the cross-cultural element was if we looked at the US participants only, we found that both their self-reported preferences strongly tracked article virality, but the Dutch students' reports of how much they liked or didn't like a given news headline were less informative about the larger scale population virality. On the other hand, brain signals in both of the samples were equally predictive. So it seemed like the neural responses to viral information were more similar across culture. And so basically consistent with our previous study, we found that these kinds of self and social relevance and value brain signals are relevant to larger scale sharing. So the very last bit of data I'm going to show you today is we wanted to translate this into something with real world impact. And so in a study, 6 different studies actually, that my postdoc Danny Cosme pooled together that ranged from topics like COVID to voting to health and climate, we manipulated the extent to which people thought about them with a frame that focused on self-relevance, social relevance, or a control. And so we took the naturalistic content and we put kind of a psychological wrapper around it to call attention to, in the self-relevance condition, why this article matters to you personally, in the social condition, why this article matters to people you know, and in the neutral control condition, just what the article was about. And what we found was that the orange dots here are the control condition. Relative to that, the social relevance manipulation did increase people's sense that the information was socially relevant and to a little bit of a degree self-relevant. And in the self-relevance condition, it increased people's perceptions of self-relevance and social relevance. And then when we looked at how much it made them want to share, both the self-relevance and social relevance manipulations increased people's interest in sharing the content. So this is an example where our neuroscience findings gave us inspiration for then a scalable behavioral intervention that we're really excited about. So our causal study results show that highlighting self and social relevance can make people more willing to share information about health, voting, climate action, and taking an even bigger step back. Today, I've shown you data that highlight the interconnectedness of our daily behaviors, not only for our immediate mood, but also for our bigger picture sense of meaning and purpose. I showed you some data that purpose is really important for our health and that helping people get more active, get more sleep might be good targets for intervention. And in addition, going the other direction, when we gave people a sense of meaning and purpose in their lives, it made their brains more receptive to positive behavior change. Then once people start to change their own minds and behaviors, giving them a chance to reflect on why those changes matter to them and people they care about also made them more willing to share and propagate those positive norms. And we know that positive norms can get more people to share, which in turn might help them feel more purposeful. We know what we hope will be sort of a positive cycle and maybe make them even feel capable of taking on the kinds of vast challenges that I opened this talk with. So with that, on a personal note, I can tell you that working with the team of folks that is responsible for all of the research that I showed you today has really been a highlight of the past few years for me, and made me feel much more capable of taking on the huge challenges that I mentioned at the beginning of the talk and lots of others. And I'm just so grateful for the opportunity to work with this team. Also really grateful to our funders, which include folks from NIH and also from the Department of Defense. And so with that, I'm going to pause and say thank you, and I can't wait to hear your questions.
Thank you so much, Professor Falk, for that wonderful talk. So we'll now begin our question and answer session. So to the audience, to ask a question or send a comment, click on Q&A at the bottom of your Zoom screen, type in your question and also press send. Also, you have the option to like other questions that have already been asked. We have about a dozen or so to avoid duplicate posts. And I'm going to start off with those that have been upvoted the most. So our first question is kind of overarching across your talk about directionality. So how do you make the determination that better health is a result of sense of purpose and not the other way around? So i.e., that people with a greater sense of purpose are more likely to be healthy rather than that healthier people are more likely to feel a sense of purpose?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And I think it goes both ways. And so kind of drawing on research, not just from our lab, but from others where folks have tried to experimentally manipulate some of these kinds of things. In the second part of the talk, for example, when we randomly assigned some people to focus on sources of purpose, like their core values, it made them more receptive to the kind of coaching that then went on to reduce their sedentary behavior, which we measured with accelerometers. So in that situation, we took a group of folks who were, for the most part, not meeting physical activity guidelines, and then we randomly assigned them to different interventions, either to be affirmed and be coached or not. And so that's like one element of purpose, is this kind of focus on core values. Or in Yuna's data from the beginning of the talk, as I mentioned, it's not causal data, but it is lagged data in time. So when we look at for example, how you felt at noon and what kinds of health behaviors you were doing at noon, and then also how you felt later in the day, at the end of the day, let's say, we can look at how much, for example, your physical activity seems like it's making you feel more purposeful, and how much feeling purposeful is making you get more, like, feel more able to do physical activity. And so I think the person who's asking this has exactly the right intuition, which is that those things can mutually feed each other, and they do it at different time scales as well. So I guess I'll pause with that to say that I think there's a lot more research to be done in this space, but so far a kind of combination of experimental research and longitudinal research suggests that both of these directions may be important. And I guess I would just add that also, like, I think it's really interesting to think, my intuition would have been feeling more purposeful makes it possible for us to do these things. But I think sometimes, like, psychologically, that feels so hard. And so if we can just go out and get a brisk walk or get a better night's sleep, sometimes those might be easier targets for intervention than having to feel like we need to put together the psychological resources to feel something big like purpose. So I really like the possibilities of building these networked models and saying, okay, for you right now, in the context that you're in, how can we inject a little bit of energy in the right part of your psychological and wellness network to spread out? And that's work that Amanda and David and other folks on our team are pursuing.
Great, thanks. Next, most popular question, did you control for mental health diagnoses? So did you ask participants if they had any diagnosis such as bipolar, MDD, or GAD?
Okay, so I presented a lot of different data today, and some of these data are published and some of these data are still in the works. So the short answer is, in some of the studies, we screened for some of these kinds of things and primarily have focused on folks who didn't have clinical diagnoses. So we're starting with folks who are relatively healthy. And a lot of the work that we do in our lab is not clinically focused. For the Webs of Wellness work, we have measured self-reports of things like depression and anxiety, and looked at how robust the models are to some of those baseline variables. But we don't have like a rich clinical setup in the way that I think could be really cool to pursue in follow-up work, and to have a wider and more diverse range of participants. But I will say, unfortunately, in our college samples, we also see really high rates of depressive symptoms and anxiety, particularly as we were doing this work during the pandemic, and folks' social networks and support systems were really taxed.
Okay, next question. Do you know whether value affirmations work similarly if subjects do not select the value they will reflect on themselves? So can you, quote unquote, enforce reflection on specific value to similarly affect self-relevant processing of persuasive messages?
Okay, I'm not sure I'm totally understanding the question, but one possible interpretation of this question is many people, for example, choose friends and family. Like in our data, I think something like 75% of people as their top rated value choose friends and family. And so one interpretation of this question is like, is the act of first saying friends and family is a really important value for me, and so now I'm going to see messages about it. Like, is that initial agentic choice important to the intervention? Or if I just said, okay, I'm going to assume that for many people, close relationships are a source of meaning and purpose and value. And then I gave those same prompts that we gave to those folks, would that be equally effective? So, Kristen, does that seem like a reasonable interpretation of the question to you?
Yeah, I think they were referring to your study where participants selected the value for themselves out of a list. I think she was asking if you had selected a different value for them that they might not have selected themselves.
Yeah, so that is the control condition for that study, is basically if we let people rank those values. So let's say I say friends and family, compassion and kindness, fame, political engagement, and wealth. So let's say wealth is my bottom rated value. What we do for the control condition is we choose a value that people said was not important to them, and then we still give them the same format of prompts. So think about a time in the future when you might get a bunch of wealth and be able to do things that you can't do now. And so we give them a bunch of these prompts that reflect on a value that wasn't the value that they would have chosen. And those are the folks who, for example, in the physical activity study, aren't changing their levels of sedentary behavior because it's not necessarily affirming to reflect on values that don't matter to you. So we use that as a control condition because it allows for the same kind of active reflection, thinking about yourself and so on, but without that key ingredient, which is that it's meaningful and that it brings you that sense of purpose.
All right, so unfortunately, we have a lot of other questions, but we've run out of time. So I'm going to turn it back over to Dr. Christine Hunter.
Thanks. And Kristen, I'd love a
All
copy
right, thank
of the
you.
questions, just so that I know what's on people's minds.
We should be able to do that, no problem.
Thanks.
So thank you, Kristen, for moderating the question and answer, and thank you to the audience for such lively questions. And thank you, Dr. Falk, for your presentation on Webs of Wellness, connections between mind, body, and community for making change. We want to thank all of you who joined us online today. If you have colleagues who are unable to join or you want to watch it again, you can remind them that a recording of today's webinar will be available in about 1 month on the OBSSR website at obssr.od.nih.gov. Today's webinar concludes the NIH OBSSR Directors Webinar Series for 2022. We're in the process of scheduling our 2023 webinar series with another engaging set of highly accomplished speakers. And so we'll provide event updates as soon as they're available. So please check out our newsletter and check in with our website for updates. To get those updates, please subscribe to the OBSSR listserv, and that'll inform you about upcoming events. And again, you can find the way to subscribe at obssr.od.nih.gov, and maybe somebody will put that in the question and answer so that's available to all of you. Related to events, please also save the dates for the 2022 NIH Behavioral and Social Sciences Research Festival. It's going to be held virtually on December 8th and 9th from 1 to 5 p.m. Eastern. And with that, this concludes today's webinar, and thank you very much for attending, and I hope all of you have a great day. Bye.